Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Ryan Davis, and I'm the chair of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located at both the park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag #TradeForum, which is also listed in your programs. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests, Larry Summers, Michael Froman, and Nicholas Burns.
Thanks, Ryan.
I am glad to have this opportunity to introduce our guest and to introduce our subject. Few subjects are as politically vexing as trade. It is not clear why trade should be quite as vexing as it is, but I think it is fair to say that in terms of internal political conflict within the Democratic Party, internal political conflict within the Republican Party, and internal political conflict in America, it is hard to find a subject that over the last 2 decades has been more divisive and controversial than international trade. At the same time, in terms of the future of the world, in terms of the future of the global economy, it is hard to imagine subjects more important than international trade and the promotion of global commerce. If, as I believe, the last 25 years have been the 25 best years in the history of the human race, if one looks at reductions in violent death, if one looks at improvements in life expectancy, if one looks at improvements in standard of living, increased international economic integration and commerce between nations has been a very, very important part of that. So trade, I don't know whether trade is more controversial or more important, but it is surely highly, highly consequential. And we could not have with us a better guest to talk about international trade issues, to talk about the political economy of international trade than Mike Froman. Mike, in a normal year, in almost any year, would have been the most distinguished member of his Harvard Law School class and of the Harvard Law Review group on which he served. I am not sure we can make that claim for Mike in the 1991 class, since a man named Barack Obama was also a member of that class and a close friend of Mike's. Mike, after serving on the Harvard Law Review, found himself before long at the Treasury Department, where he and I worked together when he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary with responsibility for Russia and Eastern Europe if you think Putin should never have come to power, you should blame Mike, who was responsible in crucial years for policy in those areas. Subsequently, Mike served as Treasury Secretary Bob Rubin's chief of staff. He then went on to a career in finance at Citigroup, where, among other things, he was a major actor in the global infrastructure space. And he returned to government in 2009 as initially the assistant to the president for international economic affairs, where he served as the president's Sherpa for the first set of economic summits, engaging with the officials from other countries in the preparatory work for those summits and in the drafting of the communiques, and more broadly participating in every aspect of international economic policy. And then, beginning in 2013, he was named as the United States trade representative, where he had responsibility for the trade policy of the United States. And he was the leading champion of, perhaps most notably, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an agreement that I believe had enormous potential to advance U.S. economic interests, but it must be said, an agreement that was repudiated by the last four candidates standing for President of the United States, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side, and Ted Cruz and Donald Trump on the Republican side. That simply reflects the vexing character of international trade, and in no way on the quality of Mike Froman's efforts. There's probably no one who has engaged longer or more thoughtfully or more pragmatically on questions of international trade, and we're lucky to have him here tonight, and we're lucky to have interviewing him our own Nick Burns, a distinguished diplomat who also played a role, along with Mike and I, in losing Russia during the 1990s. Nick, I will turn the program over to you. Mike, thank you very much for joining us.
Larry, thank you, and thank you for that nice compliment. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to interview my friend Mike Froman. We have a lot of distinguished people in the guests in the hall. I want to single out Professor Robert Lawrence, who is our trade guru here at the Kennedy School of Government, and Ambassador Jeff DeLaurentis and Professor Joe Bauer, Ambassador David Thorne, Professor Roger Porter. I've missed a lot of people, but we've got our A-team here tonight, Mike. Larry and I have this radical notion that international economic diplomacy is vital. And so we've established a fellowship program that tries to unite our respective domains, international economics, American foreign policy, and diplomacy. We had Christine Lagarde here on this stage back in October. Penny Pritzker was here, close friend and partner of Mike's, former Secretary of Commerce, and now Mike Froman. Mike's going to spend 3 days here. He has a study group with 25 of our students to talk about these international trade issues. He's meeting lots of members of the faculty. He's meeting my combined class tomorrow, my two classes tomorrow morning. So we're very grateful to him for being here. And we've got a big agenda. Mike and I are going to talk for 35 minutes or so about trade and about his administration and, of course, President Trump's administration with State of the Union at 9 o'clock tonight, and the President will certainly be talking about trade. After we've had our conversation, we'll open it up to you, and I'll give you the rules when that time comes. But, Mike, welcome. As Larry said, trade's become a lightning rod, and I wonder, Mike, you know, in a way, when Donald Trump began his campaign, when he went down the escalator at Trump Tower, he immediately took on the global trade regime and NAFTA and the TPP. The candidate for which I worked, Hillary Clinton, also disavowed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as Larry said, as did Bernie Sanders. Did you ever think when you were training to be a trade person that your entire worldview would be, in effect, repudiated by every candidate who ran for president?
This is really making me feel very good about
How
being
did that make
here.
you feel?
You know, when President Obama approached me about being trade representative, and we talked about the job, I said, in addition to TPP and these other agreements that we should negotiate, one thing I'd really like to accomplish as trade representative is help rebuild the bipartisan consensus on trade. And it turns out I have. Perhaps he should have been a little bit more directive of me about what kind of consensus he wanted to see. But look, I think it's not surprising that we saw that it built up over time a significant part of the U.S. population who felt economic insecurities around wage stagnation, around income inequality. And even though some of the great economists sitting here will tell us 80% of that impact may come from technology, not from globalization, and even though one shouldn't conflate globalization and trade agreements is how you shape globalization to take care of your people and pursue your interests, the fact is you don't get to vote on technology, and you don't really get to vote on globalization. It's just a fact of life. You get to vote on trade. And so trade becomes the vessel into which people pour their quite legitimate economic concerns, and it becomes a bit of a scapegoat for other issues.
So how do you respond to those voters, and there were millions of them, who supported Donald Trump, in part because their communities had lost manufacturing jobs to Mexico or someplace else around the world, who didn't feel that people like you and I and Larry and others who've been in government for a long time were protecting their interests? I went for the Clinton campaign to both Ohio and Pennsylvania, heard this from people when we were trying to, get them to vote for Hillary Clinton. What's the proper response to a person like that?
Well, I think you have to recognize that their concerns are very much legitimate, but I don't think the answer lies in pulling up the drawbridge and building a wall around our country, metaphorically or otherwise. It lies in actually dealing through domestic policy with a lot of the weaknesses that we have in our system. We don't do a particularly good job of preparing people with the skills they need to succeed in a rapidly changing economy. We don't do a particularly good job at helping individuals or communities transition when they're adversely affected by change, whether that change comes from technology or it comes from immigration or it comes from globalization. And to be frank, I think it's a bipartisan problem in that I think if we look back over the last 20 years, we haven't had as much political attention put to this issue as one would hope. I had expectations that after the 2016 election, Democrats often talk about these issues. Republicans tend to be a little bit more reticent about it, but that after the 2016 election, Republicans might see that a key part of their base were also concerned about these issues, and we might see more attention paid, but we haven't. We haven't really seen any serious attention paid in the political system, and I think that's going to be a problem going forward.
One of the ironies that you and I were discussing before we came down here is the fact that in most of the recent public opinion polls that ask the American people about trade, Republicans support free trade in big numbers. Democrats support free trade, which historically has not always been the case. We've seen more members of the Democratic Party in the Senate and House support from some of the big trade initiatives that you and President Obama undertook. So what's it going to take to bring us back to some semblance of political unity in the country so that our political figures can actually do something about trade?
Well, I think we're going to have to take on these domestic issues much more seriously. And also, in many respects, I think the Trump administration we're going to learn a lot through this administration in terms of confronting some of the assumptions we've had about the international system. And as the Trump administration withdraws from agreements or withdraws from leadership in various areas, I think we will see political leaders saying this isn't necessarily the right way to go. And we need to be back on our front feet, not creating voids in leadership, not deferring to others to set the rules of the road. We need to be proactive about making sure that the system is working for our workers, that we do raise labor standards and environmental standards around the world, that we do impose market disciplines on state-owned corporations, that we do protect innovation, that we do protect the digital economy and allow the free flow of information across borders. Those were all things that we did in TPP as an example that the president has stepped back from. I think we're going to have to see a resurgence of people going back to say, yeah, these are the right issues.
So the president and you and others in the administration presented an exceedingly ambitious agenda on trade from the very beginning. You finished, in essence, the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks, 40% of global GDP, 12 key countries. You had underway, but had not yet finished, a US-EU free trade agreement, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Treaty. And of course, you were modernizing NAFTA, particularly as you were negotiating TPP, because Mexico and Canada were part of that. The president, President Trump, has now single-handedly dismantled that very ambitious set of agreements. You've noticed that.
Yeah.
So let's take them one at a time. TPP, the president in Davos last week, did he open the door slightly to say that he would reconsider? What was he talking about? And how do you think, what's going to happen to the TPP 11? Prime Minister Trudeau said they're going ahead without the United States.
Well, I think what's interesting is that as the U.S. withdrew, and I think in retrospect, the decision to withdraw from TPP will be seen as one of the biggest strategic blunders in recent American history. It created a tremendous void in the region. It allowed China to step up and fill that void in ways that are not necessarily in our interests, and raised real questions about the reliability of the U.S. as a leader and as a partner. I think what's interesting is how the rest of the world's responding. As you mentioned, the other 11 countries in TPP have recently decided to move forward and implement it without us. And there are other countries that want to join TPP once those countries do. Even the UK, which, as far as I know, has one small rock in the Pacific that they have sovereignty over, Pitcairn Island. But even the UK has said when they're not in the EU anymore, they might want to join TPP. So I think the positive news is that a lot of the rules that we helped create with these other countries that raise these standards, we may well see be put in place. We will have lost some of the economic benefit as other countries move forward and get access to markets that we should have had, our farmers, our ranchers, our service providers, our workers, our manufacturers. But we'll see at least the rules be put in place. And I think that is overall a positive going forward.
You mentioned the strategic importance of this agreement. I imagine President Obama talked about this a lot. This was an opportunity for the democratic free market economies of the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific, to essentially cement a set of rules in place to which China and India would have had to react over time, because we know that both of those countries eventually wanted to join, but they would have to sign up to a set of rules that they're not now respecting. That's a big strategic loss from my perspective as a foreign policy person, major loss of American credibility and influence. And when you talk to Chinese, we were comparing notes, officials, they often thank President Trump for relieving them of the burden of being outpointed by the United States.
A Chinese official told a colleague of mine a couple of months ago, asked the colleague of mine, what do you think the chances are that President Trump will change his mind and join TPP? And my colleague rightfully said, close to nil. And the Chinese official said, thank goodness, that's the only thing the U.S. could do that would concern us. And so the question is, if TPP is such a bad deal, why are the Chinese so worried about us being part of it?
So what's the scenario where President Trump and his economic advisors find themselves back trying to recreate essentially what you worked on for 4 years? What would be the influence that would drive them in that direction?
Well, this administration has stated very clearly they prefer bilateral deals to multi-party deals, and they have a view that because we're the biggest economy in the world, they'll have more leverage if they can just focus on one country at a time. It's not actually how the trade negotiations work, in part because we're a very open economy. We have very few barriers to our economy, and when it came to TPP, half the countries we already had FTAs with. So we had nothing to offer them. The negotiating leverage we had in TPP was Japan's market access. All those countries wanted access to Japan. None of them could get it on their own. They all were riding on our coattails into Japan. And it was that triangular game that gave us the ability to get countries to raise their standards, to get Mexico to adopt binding and enforceable labor standards, things of that sort. So I think the administration will find that, first of all, there aren't that many countries interested in negotiating with us bilaterally. They're all looking at the NAFTA renegotiation process, and they're quite concerned about the direction that's going. They're seeing the other countries move ahead with their own agreements, not just the TPP 11, but the EU has a very active trade agenda. Canada has a very active trade agenda. Other countries, in some ways, are stepping up even farther and faster because the U.S. is raising questions about the global trading system. Over time, that could lead them back, theoretically, in some form or another, to a multi-party agreement. Certainly the TPP 11 would like the U.S. to join, and what they're doing is structured to make it easy. You know, they've taken about 20 provisions of TPP that are particularly important to the United States, and they said, we're going to put them over here in the separate basket, and if the U.S. ever comes back, we'll adopt those. There's an incentive for the U.S. for the U.S. to come to the table. We'll see whether it's this administration or a future administration that finds that attractive.
So your bottom line belief is that if the Trump administration does not find its way back to reopen talks with the 11 will go forward on their own?
All indications are is that they're going to move ahead.
On the European Union, these are the two largest global economies, the EU and the US. I don't believe President Trump has fundamentally rejected the idea of trade with Europe, but what he spent months talking to Chancellor Merkel and President Macron about a bilateral deal. They, of course, had to maintain their position that the EU negotiates, the EU in Brussels negotiates for all 28. How do you see that moving forward or not moving forward? There's a grand coalition coming together in Germany. By Easter, we should have a fully functioning new German government. Macron and Merkel have big ambitions for the EU. How's this going to play out?
At least as of now, the Europeans are looking around, and they've made the judgment that the U.S. isn't worth really engaging with on this issue at the moment. They've got other trade priorities, whether it's with Japan and implementing Vietnam and Singapore, or they're trying to complete an agreement with Mexico and Australia, New Zealand, Mercosur, India, etc. And I think they're playing the longer game of waiting out the administration and see what a future administration might do. So you're right. I think this administration, the Trump administration, has not completely rejected TTIP, but I think the Europeans have put it as a lower priority in their trade agenda at the moment.
And finally, NAFTA, Mike. The Trump administration is engaged in negotiations with Canada and Mexico on the modernization of NAFTA. The president himself has speculated, tweeted, but also in his public remarks, speculated that there could be an option where he walks away from NAFTA. After nearly 25 years, the press reporting in the last couple of days is that some progress has been made, but it seems to be a 50-50 proposition. In the next couple of months that the United States could possibly walk away. There's opposition from a lot of industries here. What's going to happen?
Well, look, I think it's very uncertain at the moment. I mean, first of all, NAFTA is in need of being updated and renegotiated. That's in fact what we did through TPP because Mexico and Canada were part of it. So Mexico agreed for the first time to have binding and enforceable labor standards and environmental standards and give us access to their energy market and improve investment protections and raise intellectual property rights standards. And Canada gave us access for the first time in any meaningful way to their dairy industry and poultry industry. And so those are the kinds of issues that do need to get dealt with. I think the question is, I think the administration would like to get a deal, if they can, on their own terms, but they've tabled some very difficult proposals for Canada and Mexico to accept. And as you said, the president's made clear that if he can't get a deal that is on his own terms, he is perfectly prepared to trigger the withdrawal notice and potentially to withdraw from NAFTA altogether. That would be highly disruptive. When everyone thinks of future trade agreements, what's happened in North America over the last 25 years is that you've got integrated markets, integrated production platforms, and there are estimates of losing several million jobs in the U.S. if NAFTA were to be withdrawn from.
So in our previous conversation, you seem to be leaning in the direction that there's a fairly good chance that the administration is going to decide not to leave NAFTA. There'll be some kind of new modernization deal.
I'm optimistic.
In the next couple
I'm
of
hopeful.
months.
I think it's an occupational hazard as a trade negotiator to be optimistic, because otherwise you wouldn't get up in the morning. So I am optimistic that they'll find a way forward on some of these trickier issues, but it's a very volatile situation. And one reason I'm optimistic is, after frankly being quite acquiescent and quiet for a long time about the administration's approach on trade, the business community, and including the agricultural community, has finally become mobilized to express their concern about how disruptive and destructive it would be to withdraw from NAFTA. And particularly on the agricultural side, when you look at rural America and how dependent farmers and ranchers are on exports, and exports to Canada and Mexico in particular for farm income, this begins to have political implications for this administration too.
So I want to talk to you about China. You were involved with Larry in the Treasury Department in the Clinton administration in the major policy decision to bring China into the World Trade Organization.
Larry was in favor of that, yes.
And Robert Lighthizer, your successor, said 10 days ago that that was a strategic mistake for President Clinton to bring China into the WTO, that China had come into the system, had not played by the rules to the disadvantage of the American economy. Do you agree with Robert Lighthizer?
You know, I think there's been a broad consensus for a long time, Republican and Democratic, that by engaging China, I mean, it goes back to Kissinger, Nixon, I suppose, by engaging China, bringing them into the system, giving them a seat at the table, making them trying to make them a responsible stakeholder that would help promote reform and liberalization in China. And there's no doubt that China has reformed in many significant ways. It's not been a linear process. It's not as far and as fast as we would all like. And I agree with the Trump administration's concern about the challenge that China poses to the U.S. economy and to the global economy. I think the problem with that argument, though, is what is the counterfactual? What we don't know is if China had remained outside the WTO all these years, what additional activities would they have engaged in, feeling no constraint from the WTO, that would have been even more detrimental to us? So it's easy to criticize and say we shouldn't have done that. It's a little harder to say with any certainty that had we not done that, that we would be in a better situation.
How do you respond to a lot of our political leaders in both parties who now say that the Chinese are not adhering to their responsibilities on intellectual property protection for American companies that invest in China, that China has not been a fair trade partner of the United States? I mean, doesn't President Trump have a point here that we need to be tougher? And why do you expect he will be in 2018? Because this past year, he pulled a lot of his punches. He needed Xi Jinping to help on North Korea, but it looks like the Trump team is gearing up for more trade action.
Yeah, look, I think he does have a point about the concerns there. He does seem to be gearing up to take a series of trade actions. He's taken one action on solar panels that affects China, washing machines to a lesser degree, and there are a number of others in the pipeline that are ready to be decided on. I think the question is not whether China is a challenge, it's what to do about it and how do you affect Chinese behavior. And what I worry about is that we'll get seduced by what one might call the shopping list approach to U.S.-China relations, where the Chinese say, tell us how many planes you want us to buy, how many soybeans you want us to buy, how much you want us to invest in the Midwest, and then leave us alone on everything else. As opposed to us continuing to put pressure and to build international pressure to put on China to engage in meaningful economic reform. A lot of the issues are real. I think there's been some improvement on intellectual property as China itself begins to develop meaningful intellectual property, but there is a long way to go to make it a better environment and a more fair and level playing field.
The Trump administration is warning of additional trade actions against China, but also against the European Union. Wilbur Ross was quoted 10 days ago, just before Davos, talking about a trade war of sorts, and there was a big reaction during the Davos meeting by the Europeans to that. What's your sense of that?
You know, even with partners with whom we have very deep trade relations, like the European Union and Canada, we have serious trade frictions too. And the question again is, how do you resolve them. We can get into a tit for tat of imposing tariffs on each other or taking other actions. Part of the value of the WTO is bringing these cases, getting a determination, holding people to a rules-based system. We have benefited enormously from that. We're the largest user of the WTO dispute settlement procedure. We brought 26 cases during the Obama administration, 16 against China. We won every case that went to resolution. And so I think one of the things that we need to watch out for is that this administration not undermine the WTO and its dispute settlement body, because if every country, we have our own checks and balances in the US when it comes to protectionism. We've got importers, we've got members of Congress, we have our own constraints. Other countries are not so constrained. And if it looks like the US is picking and choosing which international obligations it's going to abide by, we're giving a license to other countries, not just to retaliate against us, but to imitate us. And you have 160 countries deciding what they're going to live by and what they're not going to live by. That's not going to be good for our exports and our jobs and our workers here.
So we want to take questions from the audience. I want to ask you one question before we do that, and that's about your relationship with President Obama and the discussions that you and Larry and others had with him after his election, after he took office in January 2009. He had not been someone who had been involved in multilateral or bilateral trade before he came to office. Democrats, particularly progressive Democrats, traditionally have been skeptical of the kind of ambitious trade regimes that you eventually adopted. What was that conversation like in the beginning of months of the administration, setting up the architecture for what turned out to be a very ambitious agenda?
Well, at the risk of being an armchair psychoanalyst, I think the president really had two strands of thought from his experience. One, born in Hawaii, spending formative years living in Asia, living in Indonesia, he totally got, intuitively, international economics, international trade, the importance of it. And the first time we went to Asia together and met with people there, he very much felt the importance of trade and how central it was to not only the growth of the region, but reducing poverty, excuse me, and other priorities. At the same time, he had the experience of being an organizer on the south side of Chicago, where he saw steel mills close and other factories close. And he made clear to us through all the early meetings of the administration and throughout that if we're going to do a proactive trade agenda, it's got to be a progressive trade agenda, meaning we've got to use our trade tools to raise labor standards, improve workers' rights, raise environmental standards, make sure the countries are enforcing them, deal with corruption issues in other countries and regulatory transparency. And we've got to use it as a way of really raising up the standards that countries have to live by, both because that's a good in and of itself. We care about workers in other countries because we care about the dignity of work. We also care about it because it's about leveling the playing field for our workers. That we want to make sure that our workers are not competing against countries that have no labor rights or that have forced labor. And so we used TPP and our trade agreements precisely to do those things and to raise that standard, because I think it was a reflective of his direction of both the importance of engagement in U.S. leadership and the importance of never forgetting who it is we're working for and what are the values that we need to include in our policies.
Thank you. Let's go to your questions. We have microphones on the floor to my left and right. We have 2 microphones in the immediate first balcony. Please identify yourself. Please make sure that your question has a question mark attached to the end of it. We have a number of professors in the front row. If anyone would like to ask a question, we will pass you a mic to do so. But if you're not raising your hands now, sir, I'll go to you.
Sure. Dan Cunningham, I'm a proud Harvard alum, and I live in Ohio. And I want to talk about future American leadership. And we all understand Ricardo's theorem and comparative advantage. And our leadership, post-World War II leadership, was a particular time in the history of the world. It's a different world today. We understand 70 years ago it was different. Marshall Plan and all that. But I wonder if we have here comes the question, Nick, don't worry. I wonder if we have what I call the vitamin problem here, where you and I hear that vitamins are good for us, and we began to eat vitamins all the time. And I'm talking about global trade as a way to increase wealth. But we began to eat nothing but vitamins. We began to do nothing but global trade. It's an exaggeration, but if we don't change our diet, we will get sick and die. So I wonder about a new paradigm for American leadership, different perhaps than the post-World War II time, where we can't continue to put such stresses on people that aren't benefiting. And the political instability comes from that. Is there a new paradigm for American leadership in the world? And I certainly don't want to say, well, if that's what it is, I don't want to do it. But are we moving? Can we move to a new type of leadership that fits today as opposed to post-World War II? Thank you.
So I think you're right in that the system that the United States helped lead and help create and support throughout the last 70 plus years, on one hand, it was tremendously successful. It allowed for the reconstruction of Europe and Japan, which became major markets for us, created stability in those regions, peace. It allowed developing countries to become emerging economies. It helped contribute to the most significant alleviation of poverty in human history, as Larry alluded to. It's been very positive. On the other hand, I think there has been a free rider problem of other countries quite willing to let us pay the price of maintaining the system by us keeping an open economy while they maintained protections, whether it was Japan in the 70s and 80s, or whether it's China more recently, or even Europe and others who have continued to have some significant protection. And not every country has stepped up to pay its part of the system. And I think getting them to do that would be a very positive outcome. But I don't think the answer is for us to give up our leadership, because I tend to believe in American leadership and that what we have put forward out there not only serves our interests, but serves the interests of the broader community, but to try and get others to buy into it. It would be great for China to show the kind of global leadership that we did. But thus far, I think China's been remarkably disciplined about pursuing its self-interest narrowly defined. And sometimes when you're pursuing the role of a leader, you've got to pursue your enlightened self-interest. And we haven't seen China do that in many respects yet.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Henry Liu, an undergraduate in one of Ambassador Burns' classes. And my question is, to what extent will this administration's policies leave a lasting impact on America's trade relations? Or do you think a pro-trade successor would be able to readily, join TPP, rejoin potentially NAFTA, and just come back on the track of trade policies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I take it in two parts. One is, I think we've gone from what Madeleine Albright used to call the indispensable nation to being relatively isolated as a nation. And I worry that we're on our way to becoming an irrelevant nation, where other parties say, we're just going to wait this administration out. We can wait 3 years, maybe even 7 years, but at least 3 years, and see what the next administration's policies are before we really engage. I don't think damage is permanent. I think, I say that, but I think the damage to our reputation about being a reliable partner is hard to recover from. And I think it's going to take several administrations to try and recover from that. But when it comes to trade policy itself, I think it depends a little bit on how the political pendulum swings. Right now, you've got a remarkable bedfellows emerging in defense of NAFTA. People who have been anti-trade most of their life coming out in defense of NAFTA because they've come to appreciate just how disruptive withdrawal would be. Whether that is the beginning of building a base of support for further engagement, I think remains to be seen. But if it is, then that's a hopeful sign.
Yes, right over here.
Bill Overholt from the Asia Center. To what extent is China's Belt and Road program a fundamental challenge to what we're trying to achieve? To what extent is it an extension of what we traditionally have tried to achieve with the Bretton Woods system and global development program?
This has been a great year to be President Xi. If you think about a year ago at Davos, he got to go to Davos and declare that he and China were the leader of the global trading system in light of the U.S. Retreat. He convened the One Belt, One Road Summit in May, 30 heads of state, and quite a broad, it's a really quite remarkable strategic initiative in terms of what its potential breadth and depth is. And I believe that the Chinese believe it to be an important new piece of global architecture, as you said, like Bretton Woods, only under Chinese control. And whether it's limited to infrastructure and trade, or whether it becomes a body for beginning to discuss broader political issues or security issues like maritime security, I think remains to be seen. But there certainly are, even if it's not fully implemented, there certainly are significant aspirations for it. And so I think it is. Now, I think China was going to have a good year regardless, because they were gearing up their soft power, they were gearing up the One Belt, One Road initiative. But as the Chinese have indicated to us, the combination of the retreat from leadership by the U.S. and the fact that they were stepping up has accelerated their plans. And they now find themselves years ahead of where they expected to be at the moment. And I think that is going to be a very difficult, to go to the previous question, that's going to be a very difficult set of developments to roll back.
Mike, let me ask you a follow-up to Bill's question, because the Indian government has taken the position that they see the Belt Road Initiative as a threat to them strategically. They think that China is going to combine that initiative with Chinese naval activities designed to limit India's movements in the Bay of Bengal and the Western Pacific. The Japanese have been reluctant as well. What's the proper decision by our country? The Obama administration made a decision on the AIIB, which most people thought was not the right decision, to try to put China to the side and not to accept the fact that China has something to offer to the world. What should President Trump do on this?
Look, I don't think it's particularly useful for us to try and prevent the One Belt, One Road initiative going forward. I think it has all the momentum in the world, and the Chinese are willing to put political capital and financial capital behind it. But what it points out is the absence of anything else. The Chinese have a regional strategy. They've got One Belt, One Road. They have the Silk Road Fund. They have the Asian Infrastructure Bank. They have their approach to the South China Sea. They have RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, their equivalent of TPP. So far, the Trump administration has not put forward a counterproposal. There's one discussion about the Indo-Pacific Pact and bringing India more into the Asia-Pacific on military issues or strategic issues. But that's hardly a substitute for what TPP, engagement with ASEAN, the troop movements that we made around Darwin, and the sort of multi-pronged approach that the Obama administration had, security, political, and economic, to show that we are a Pacific power, we've always been one, we're here to stay, and that our partners in the region can count on us. Everyone needs a positive relationship with China. This isn't about containing China. We need a positive relationship with China. But our partners and allies in the region want there to be an alternative that they can work with as well, even as they work with China. And that we've yet to come up with.
Thank you. We'll go right up here.
Hi, I'm Fernando. I'm a postdoc at the Kennedy School. So when you take an introductory trade course here, they tell us that just promoting trade surplus for the sake of a trade surplus is called mercantilism, and it's an old fallacy. But it appears that both presidential candidates in 2016 were mercantilists, and most of this conversation about China being a challenge promotes this view of the world as a zero-sum game. So my question is, are there any representatives of the current or previous administration that don't hold these views? Or is it considered that just free trade is a crazy idea that's only held like at the ivory tower, but the real world is actually more mercantilist than we think?
Yeah, I think if you look over time and you look at the successive rounds of trade talks under the GATT and then the WTO, tariffs have come down tremendously around the world on a multilateral level. In the US, economists estimate that the various rounds of tariff reductions have added about $14,000 to each American family's income. because they can get access to more products more affordably. And when you look around the world and the impacts of trade liberalization and good, sound macroeconomic policies on developing countries, it's very significant in terms of poverty alleviation. So I don't think it's just an ivory tower idea. No country is absolutely perfect, but I think it's too stark to say it's mercantilist or free trade. I think the challenge we have with China is that the rules-based system that was created, first with the GATT and then the WTO, assumed a certain degree of market dominance, market forces being the dispositive factor in decision-making. And if you've got a state-controlled economy with a lot of subsidies and state-owned banks and directed industries and a series of policies around IP or technology transfer that distort those market factors, that's a hard thing for the international system to digest. It's not very well designed to do that. So we need to find other tools. And those other tools include, when we need to, taking enforcement actions. It includes organizing the rest of the world to put pressure and to encourage reform. It means finding reformers within China who are trying to reform the system so that it becomes more open and more liberal over time. I think there's more work to be done in that regard. But it takes an all-out effort, and simply imposing a few tariffs or calling names is not a policy. You know, you've got to have a concerted strategy to create rules and encourage them to abide by those rules.
Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks. Nathaniel Eisen, MPP1 here. Along those lines, what qualitative difference is there between American subsidies for solar panels and Chinese subsidies?
Well, I think, one, there aren't that many subsidies left in the U.S. on solar panels. And by the way, we're not producing very much here, which has been part of the problem and what led to the trade case. You know, our anti-dumping and countervailing duty procedures are pretty, they're pretty sound. They're not subject to a lot of political influence, at least not historically. They tend to be done, by career people, and then the ITC, the International Trade Commission, which is independent and bipartisan, makes certain judgments about injury. And sometimes, as it has just happened with the Bombardier case with Canada, our own institutions find against, our own policies, saying, well, there actually wasn't subsidies there that rose to the level of countervailable subsidies. So, I think there are checks and balances within our system on that. I think the problem with China, one, is that it's not terribly transparent, that you've got a whole series, whether it's in the inputs or in the financing. When you take something like steel or aluminum, and you see the amount of state-owned bank financing that may go into these companies that help lead to overcapacity, or policies that direct provinces to produce more and more of a product regardless of what the market signals are, that's when there becomes distorted policies.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name's Josh, and I'm a graduate student here at HKS. I was hoping you could return to the acquiescence you described in the American business community, because I'd love to hear your perspective on why there hasn't been, at least in the first year of the Trump administration, a more organized lobbying effort to push back on some of the policies he's pursued.
I think the American business community sort of made the judgment, and they've got to make the judgment from their perspective, what's right for their shareholders and other stakeholders, that they prioritized tax cuts and regulatory relief. And if the administration would give them meaningful tax cuts and regulatory relief, they were willing to hold their nose on trade and to a certain extent immigration. They wanted all four, but they put a priority on the first two. They've gotten their tax cuts. The regulatory relief is an ongoing process. I think the big difference here, no company came out, or very few companies came out in January last year and criticized the president for withdrawing from TPP. But there's a big difference between losing something that you have, like NAFTA, and advocating for something that is aspirational, that gives you an opportunity in the future. And I think once it looked possible that the administration would withdraw from NAFTA, it brought people off the sidelines and into the game. And we'll see whether that has a lasting impact or not.
Thank you. Yes?
Hi. One of the objections to the Trans-Pacific Partnership was investor-state dispute settlement. And in NAFTA renegotiation, one of the progressive asks has been to remove Chapter 11. Is there a why does it have to be there in the first place, and especially why does it have to take the form of foreign corporations being able to bring actions and ask for compensation in excess of what they actually invested and presumably lost?
Thank you.
I'm not sure about that last point, but the background of investor state, for those who aren't into the details, is it really goes back, 1959, I think, was the first agreement. Well, in some ways it goes back to the Jay Treaty, when we were resolving claims coming out of the Revolutionary War, and we wanted independent, neutral tribunals to resolve claims. But in its modern form, the idea was, as companies are investing in countries around the world, if countries take actions that expropriate their property, those companies don't want to have to rely on local courts to sue the local government, because they worry about whether they'll be getting adequately compensated for that. So they could go to neutral international arbitration. And the various bilateral investment treaties and then free trade agreements tended to include that. They've been around for a while, and over the years we have, and TPP was an example of this, we've raised the standards, we've made it difficult. There have been some bad cases. We've tried to learn from the bad cases and say, okay, let's close this loophole. Let's raise the standard. Let's make sure, for example, companies can't sue just because they were disappointed by their profits or just because the regulatory regime changed. In TPP, we did something quite controversial. We said, because we found that tobacco companies had abused the ISDS system beyond what was expected, we said countries can carve themselves out of coverage when it comes to tobacco-related health regulations. And so we tried over the years to raise that standard. Now that TPP is not moving forward for the U.S., we're stuck with all the old ISDS. So you would think that if people were concerned about ISDS, you'd want to see the new, reformed, higher standard methods. It'll be interesting to see. Again, the Trump administration, I think, has expressed a willingness to drop ISDS altogether. Now what we're seeing is that other countries, including Mexico and Canada, don't want to, because Canadian companies want to make sure they have protection in Mexico. Mexican companies want to make sure that their country is seen as a good place for investors, where investors can get recourse to neutral international arbitration. And by the way, there have been lots and lots of cases where our investors, have been expropriated, and where the only reliable remedy came from investor-state dispute settlement. So I think that's where the debate will come.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Hi, Liam DeClivelo. I'm a student at the Harvard Extension School. So you mentioned at the very beginning of your talk about the fact that trade has become the scapegoat for a lot of the hollowing out of America's manufacturing sector and joblessness. But we know that there are plenty of other countries, high-wage countries, that have very healthy manufacturing sectors, places like Germany. So what do you think, if we want to make the American people more comfortable with trade, what do you think we can do in the area of the industrial policy to bring those jobs back or create manufacturing jobs that will make people more comfortable?
Well, first, I think if you look historically, and I'm sure Bob or others here have this data, or Roger have this data at their fingertips better than I do. If you had a graph of the number of workers or the percentage of workers in manufacturing in industrial countries, you would have seen it decline from the late 1950s to the present time. By the way, long before there were any free trade agreements. Remember, our first free trade agreement was with Israel in the 1980s. So this isn't a long history there. Long before that, we were losing manufacturing jobs because of, largely, technology. And if you were to superimpose the graph of Germany on the graph of the United States, you would find it looks almost identical. So even those big, what are rumored or what are thought to be manufacturing powerhouses and manufacturing export powerhouses have seen exactly the same kind of increases in productivity, largely because of technology, declining percentage of workers or numbers of workers in the manufacturing sector, and new jobs created in services and other areas to compensate for that. And now when you look at a manufactured product, more and more manufacturing is service related. It's software. You take an automobile. An automobile has upwards of 80 million lines of code now. Well, is that manufacturing? Is the R&D part manufacturing? So there's a lot that's going into what we think of as manufacturing that really is service related, information related, and it's a more complicated picture, I think, than one looks at first.
Thank you. We're going to try to get in 2, maybe 3 final questions, and we'll start with you.
Thank you. I'm Taku Nemoto from Harvard Law School. I want to ask you another Chinese question about China. Do you think the WTO system, in particular dispute settlement system, is still effective to deal with China, especially trade distortion caused by China's state-owned enterprises? Or should we also deal with trade issues caused by China outside of the WTO system? If so, how to do it? How to deal with it?
So I think the WTO system is important vis-a-vis China because China actually at one level or another does care when the WTO comes down against it. And it changes its policy. Now, it may take too long to do so, and it may put in place a new policy that's almost as bad as the old one, but they do listen when multilateral organizations tend to fight against them. I think the problem is that at the multilateral level, some of the standards aren't terribly high. Remember, these are agreements that have been reached with more than 100 countries. So there's a bit of a lowest common denominator element to them, state-owned enterprises being one. The standards at the multilateral level are not terribly high. That's precisely why you need agreements like TPP, where you bring in developed and developing countries. Vietnam had an enormous state-owned sector. Malaysia has a very large state-owned sector. And for Malaysia and Vietnam to agree to a set of high standards for state-owned enterprises with Japan, the United States, and other developed countries was very significant. And it meant that was the direction that area of rules might head in.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you for the interesting discussion. I'm Dora Sari. I'm a research fellow at Harvard Law School Labor and Work-Life Program. During your discussion, you referred to the labor provisions multiple times that are included now in trade agreements, and also the fact that those are, at least in the case of the U.S. signed agreements, enforceable. And I was wondering whether, in view of the outcome of the U.S.-Guatemala case, do you think there is a need to revisit the reality of those procedures that are available? Thank you.
I think it's a very good question. I think if those of you who want to read all of TPP, it's all online. You're welcome to read it. But if you're going to read one piece of TPP, read the 12-page Vietnam Labor Consistency Plan. It's quite a remarkable document because it lays out the kind of changes that Vietnam would have to adopt before they got access to our market. So we had real leverage there. And it raises the standards, it tightens some of the provisions that have proven to be too weak in other agreements, and you make reference to the Guatemala case in particular, which I think helps underscore why you need higher standards in this area and why you need very specific provisions. But Vietnam, at the end of the day, agreed to allow independent labor unions who could elect their own leaders, control their own finances, strike, affiliate with who they wanted to affiliate with, get assistance from outside their country, and they didn't get access to our market until they did those things. Of course, now, none of that's happening. And so I always ask my friends in labor and my progressive friends, you care so much about this, is it really better that this is not happening than if it did?
Mike, I want to ask a follow-up. Do you think we're going to reach a point in 2018 where some of the traditionally pro-trade Republicans in the Senate and House are going to begin to make the arguments that you've just made to the White House that we've actually got to have a strategy in East Asia? Just to talk about that for a minute. Because traditionally, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, Bob Corker, most of these senior Republicans who are committee chairs have been pro-trade. We've seen, I think, very disturbing in the last 48 hours that all the senators who voted for Russia sanctions on the Republican side are now not pressuring the Trump administration to implement them. So you might make an argument that these Republicans are going to be quiet, but the stakes are so high strategically. You said it's the greatest strategic loss that we will have suffered. Are we going to see that kind of courage, intellectual courage from Republicans in the Senate and House?
It's been few and far between, to say the least. I mean, there have been some who've spoken out, and some of the usual suspects who speak out more frequently than others, but people like Senator Roberts, who's the chair of the Agriculture Committee, has been quite active in pushing the administration. They've been more, I think, behind the scenes than in front and publicly pushing out. And until they do push, I mean, for those who either expected Trump to govern differently than he campaigned, to have different views than what he expressed, or for the Republican leadership to put constraints on them, I think people feel quite disappointed. And so hopefully going forward, we'll see more of that. And even in the last 24 hours, Chairman Hatch of the Finance Committee has said he's hoping to see more out of the administration on a positive trade agenda. But until they really put pressure on, I don't think they're not going to see the results that we're going to see.
And we really didn't get this before. Do you expect anything of consequence on trade tonight in State of the Union? Beyond what he said in Davos?
It's a little risky being up here right now, since in 2 hours everything I just said could be proven to be wrong. The administration's indicated that trade is going to be part of the State of the Union, but I have no sense of what it's going to be other than probably a pretty firm message on reciprocal trade, asserting America first, and whether there was rumors that he might trigger the withdrawal from NAFTA. I think those rumors have sort of been tamped down, but we'll all see at 9 o'clock.
We will, and by the way, Carrie reminds me that the IOP is showing the State of the Union on this screen at 9 o'clock tonight. Last question.
Thank you. I'm Liz King from Greater Boston Trade Justice. My question is this. At the time of the TPP, the organization Doctors Without Borders, they put out a statement saying that were the TPP to be enacted, the patent protection would be such that a lot of people, that their patients in Africa and many other countries would really lower the cost of medication for them would be so high that there would be a lot of problems with their diseases. Can you answer what would you have said to them?
We actually did have a good dialogue with them. It's one of the trickiest issues because when it comes to pharmaceutical products, much of the innovation is done in the United States and in Europe. And if there aren't incentives to do that innovation, then there will be no drugs for anybody anywhere in the world. So you're always striking a balance between making sure that there are sufficient incentives, and the issue in TPP in particular was around the period of data protection, not patents, but data protection for biologics, the new kinds of medicines that are being developed, and ensuring access to those drugs as quickly as possible and as affordably as possible in developing countries. So if you see, for example, we included a number of flexibilities for developing countries in TPP so that they could get access to drugs quicker. We took, for example, one thing that Doctors Without Borders and the generic industry advocated for was that we take some provisions that had previously been in a Peru agreement, and we did, and we included them in TPP more generally. But the result we came out with, which was not the 12 years that the US pharmaceutical industry wanted, but not the 0 years that the Doctors Without Borders wanted, managed to satisfy nobody. And both the pharmaceutical industry was against it, Doctors Without Borders was against it. So I don't know if that's a good sign that we managed to do something right in the middle that both couldn't sign on to, but clearly we didn't end up in one camp or the other.
Because their statement they maintained their statement, so whatever you guys decided must not have been satisfied enough.
They certainly weren't satisfied because they don't believe in any patent protection. If we don't have any patent protection or any data protection, then we don't have any new drugs. And there won't be anything to make a generic copy of and to distribute in Africa or anywhere else.
So, Mike, you answered a lot of our questions. You're going to be here for the next 2 days. You'll meet many more of our students. Thank you for your public service. Thank you for what you did for our country, and thank you for being at Harvard. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.